Welcome to Yo Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Matt Rader, Assistant Professor of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Rader is the author of 4 poetry collections, the most recent titled Desecrations, and a critically acclaimed collection of short stories titled What I Want to Tell Goes Like This. Rader earned an MFA from the U of O's Creative Writing program in 2008. On November 7th, 2018, he gave a reading at the U of O as guest of the Creative Writing program. Thanks, Matt, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So first, because it's very important to your writing, tell us a little bit about your background. Where are you from?
I grew up in the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island, so it's on the east coast of Vancouver Island, about 3 hours north of Victoria, which is the capital of BC, on the Salish Sea. My dad was a long-haul trucker, and then he became a crane operator, and my mom was a child protection worker. So we had a kind of blue-collar, working-class life.
And how did you wind up becoming a writer? How did you wind up going that path?
Both my parents were readers. I think that, was a big part of it. Even, my dad may have been a blue-collar guy, but he was always reading. And I think I wrote my first poem when I was in grade 4 with my mom. We went for a walk and wrote this poem, and it just kind of stuck with me. I went to university. I wanted to be an illustrator. I'd started in studio art, and I was taking creative writing classes at the same time. And at a certain point, I just decided there was more room for me as a writer to grow than there was for me as an illustrator. Like, I could be a passable illustrator, but I might be a better writer if I worked at it,
I think anybody who reads your writing would say that you made the right choice.
Yeah, thanks.
So you got your MFA here at the University of Oregon.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything particular that this program taught you as a writer? Tell me one thing that you think you learned here from the profs here.
I wanted to learn how to read and think when I came here. Like, that was actually in my explicit, when I wrote my statement, what I wanted to do. I wanted to learn to think better. And Professor Hongo and Doran and Karen Ford was my supervisor. And they taught me to read with a kind of discipline that I had never really had before. And it really changed my life.
Excellent. So the most recent volume of poetry is called Desecrations. First, tell us about that title.
Well, it wasn't, of course, the original title. We went through a few different possibilities. Originally, it was going to be called Winter Horses, but which is the title of one of the poems, and it felt a little bit like, I don't know, I could imagine some kind of famous poet having a book called Winter Horses. And then I wanted to call it Talking Trojan War Blues, and my editor said he just kept hearing Bob Dylan whenever I said that line. So Desecrations was what we settled on, partly because it seems dramatic, and I was interested in the possibilities of creation once something has been removed from a sacred position. Once things were in ruins to some degree, what could you make from that? And so that's why the title.
Interesting. So the volume begins even before the epigraphs with your adaptation, your translation from the first canto of Dantes Inferno. So would you read that poem?
You bet. From Dantes Inferno, Canto 1, lines 1 to 18. In the milieu of middle age, life left turned me to a wooded maze, and the good old way forward went AWOL, 404, MIA. Ah, hell, it's tough to say what was what in those savage chiaroscuro trees. So bitter cold a coffin sounded cozy. Just speaking of it now gives me the willies. But all that goes with grace, believe me, comes that way, so I say what I have to say. Can't point to the place where I near kipped in those nasty sticks. I was bushed, blotto, ready to rack out when I strayed. I hit bottom at the bottom of a steep hill that lifted, then skirted the valley where all my fear and doubt came to play. Vested and invested with that celestial light, we know shows men the sure road. The ridge was dressed in fiery clothes.
So first of all, what attracted you to that? I mean, it's one of the most famous passages from the Inferno.
Yeah.
And your adaptation or your translation or whatever you want to call it that you've done here, it's so striking. It's so unusual. I mean, there's millions of translations of this thing. It sounds so contemporary. The voice is so of our time. What attracted you to this, to start this way?
Well, maybe it's a kind of desecration of Dante, for starters. I had this experience of Dante, and I, of course, read many different versions of it. And I once took Italian for a couple of years and sort of forced my way to read part of it in Italian. And I had a version of this poem that was running around in my head that was not like any of the ones I ever saw anywhere. And it was kind of an attitude that I intuited about the poem, Dante's poem, that I just hadn't felt in other versions of it. Dante's talking about a very specific age at the beginning of and I was at the same age as Dante at the time, and so that was part of it too, is that I was living that part of my life. And the other thing, there are formal aspects, but the contemporary diction, I think, lets me create rhymes in a different way. So I was trying to find a way for the poem to sound like it was folding in on itself in the same way that Terza Rima does, but without doing that exact move.
And he is the author of vernacular literature, the father of vernacular literature, and it's hard for us to imagine that it was a vernacular poem when we read it, because it's this holy thing. Yeah,
and he really takes shots at everybody. Like, I don't know, I thought there was an attitude to it that was worth exploring.
Yeah. So after that poem in the volume, you have these two epigraphs. The first is from Gwendolyn Brooks. I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. And the second comes from Frank O'Hara. I am a Hittite in love with a horse. So tell us about those two epigraphs. Why did you choose them? Why did you juxtapose them? Or whatever you want to tell us about them.
Well, actually, Professor Ford is the person who introduced me to Gwendolyn Brooks. And I don't know if I have a lot to say about that particular epigraph, except for that Brooks was somebody whose spirit I wanted to invoke. And then that epigraph came after I decided about the title. So I was going back through Brooks and found this, and it just seemed too appropriate to leave out.
Yeah.
And then O'Hara is also a character who appears in my collection in a few different places. I thought it was funny, and it's from a poem called "In Memory of My Feelings," which is the space that I'm moving more and more towards. Like, what are feelings? And there's something just really weird about that sense. And together they have this kind of a nice juxtaposition, I think. Also, living in Canada and being Canadian, having a Canadian publisher, or this is Penguin, but it's a Canadian imprint of Penguin. Something about having Americans at the beginning also has a kind of tension on the north of the border that it's hard to explain here, I think.
Maybe less hard to explain these days than it once was.
Well, maybe it would be hard, I think, for fellow Canadians to see why I would want to invoke some of the American poets. Although so many Canadians now come to the U.S. to do MFAs too, so there's a kind of strange. Like when I came, it didn't happen all that often, but in the last 10 years, it's happened more and more frequently.
I think the juxtaposition of Brooks and O'Hara is a great juxtaposition. Just in general, those two are such amazing poets. So much of your work is firmly located in the places and spaces of Vancouver Island. But Desecration is also an insistently Irish volume. Many of the poems are written about and in response to Irish places and people. Why? Why did Ireland suddenly become so important in this volume?
Well, I think I was spellbound by Irish poets for a long time. That was definitely one of the things. I have an Irish grandmother. And a few things, like some coincidences happened. I met a poet from Ireland called John Ennis, who was the Dean of Humanities at the Waterford Institute of Technology, and he was doing these anthologies of Canadian and Irish poems, and so we became connected when one of these anthologies came out, and he invited me to his farm, and he said, if you can get to Ireland, you can stay here as long as you want, and we'll look after you. So I did. I was actually working on a much longer prose piece at the time, and I needed some extended time away. And then from that, I made 3 trips to Ireland in 2 years, and went all over the island. And I think I had written so much about Vancouver Island, and thought about Vancouver Island extensively. And even when I was in Oregon, I found it useful to be just a little bit away from Vancouver Island to get that perspective. And there is a thing about growing up on an island and living on an island that other islanders share. I know that folks from Newfoundland or Hawaii that I've worked with, they have that sense, and Ireland has that too, right? And so I was really interested in what it could show me about Vancouver Island, even though I'm not making those direct connections. There are some other thoughts. I've been interested for a long time about what it means to be from a place and to be indigenous to a place. And in British Columbia, it's mostly unceded territory, so there are no legal treaties, or very few legal treaties between the indigenous peoples and the state. So this question of how you become indigenous in British Columbia is one kind of thing, but in Ireland it's a whole other problem. And it was really useful for me to think about that kind of complexity in the Irish context.
Would you read the poem that's dedicated to John Ennis? It's
Yes.
Hightown, Coralstown, Mullingar, County West.
Yeah, this is John's address. It's actually where I wrote the poem, the Dante poem too, was walking around his fields. My first day in Hightown, we called on the fields where your people seeded and reseeded the grass for centuries. The forge field where your boy hopes to build a new home, where horse teams were hayed and reshod on the highway between Dublin and Galway. The hurling field or field for dancing, where the long-bearded pipers played in the evening with the fiddler down the Boreen. And the lone bush field, where you've asked your children to leave your remains with the unnamed babies beneath the thorn, the stillborns, aborts, unbaptized. Where your man from Erin blessed the unmarked graves, where your father staggered one night and returned, unable to speak.
So that poem, like a good number of poems in the volume, is a sonnet. It's an unrhymed blank verse sonnet. What is it about that form? I mean, I didn't count how many sonnets are in the volume, but there's a good number.
Quite a few, yeah.
What was it about that form that attracted you?
That's a really excellent question. And I think I might have gone to a certain point with it that I no longer really have a clear answer. I think originally there was a form that I felt was small enough that I could practice in, like there's a space for me to practice. So there's a sonnet in my first book, and then they kind of like just multiply as I go through. And then by the time I was writing Desecrations, they kind of just had shaped my lyric thought. So anything that was of a certain space seemed to find its way into that form. I think also there's a kind of it compresses everything, and so there's always something left over, and those things tend to make other poems, right? And so it's easy to have a serial set of sonnets, and that's one of the ways for me to decide which content belongs in which poem. There's probably a lot more to say. At this point, I'm not even sure what is definitive of a sonnet. Like, there are sonnets of with 16 lines and 11 lines and in every rhetorical pattern, every metrical pattern. Like, so what makes it a sonnet? I'm not really sure. I've been writing these 30 to 33 line poems in tercets that have like 1 or 2 beats a line. And I actually think they're basically sonnets. They're just stretched out, but they have that same kind of shape. You know, it's a set of proportions that you can mix and match in various ways, but they kind of, I know it persists.
Very interesting. So there are other things that persist in the volume.
Yes.
One of the other things that persists is Homer.
Yeah.
So there's like 5 or 6 poems that are allusions to Homer, that are about the characters in Homer. There's one called Homer.
Yeah. Where did this come from?
Yeah, what's that about?
I think this might be the influence of Michael Longley. So the Irish poets in general, but Longley in particular, who has been for a long time kind of rewriting moments in the Iliad and Odyssey, and so you know, when I first started writing, I wrote about like the places that I lived, and then I wrote about like the things that were around where I lived and the stories from my family. And after a while, it turned out that a lot of my life was literature, and then it seemed only natural. Like I feel like I'm living this life that's through a scrim of literature. So I encounter people and lines from poems and arise, and I think that that's what was happening. That like I was reading Longley sort of very seriously for 10 years, and then I had to read Homer because in order to be there with Longley, I needed to know some of the things he knew, and then I've just been carrying it around. So I think there's something else too about wanting to draw from as deep a part of Western literature as I could and try to draw them together in some way, to reach back.
You know, you do, in some of the poems that are alluding to the Iliad and the Odyssey, you do a similar thing that you do in that Dante poem, which is to colloquialize them or to bring them into the sort of diction of our time. Is it a related kind of interest for you to be doing it there as well as with the Dante?
I think so. I think there's, I mean, this is something I think I learned from Longley. Like Longley is one of the projects is trying to elicit a kind of contemporary emotion from a historical or text. So when he's writing about Andromache and Hector, he's trying to say something about now, right? And it gives me permission to look at what's timeless in all of those things. So it's less about the form or the language even itself. There's something else going on that's timeless. And so when I adapt the language to a more colloquial, contemporary vernacular, then I think it's one way of gesturing at that. That's like the form is not actually the most important part of the poem. The form is a sort of shape through which we can see something that persists, that's timeless.
Well, I have to say, when I read the poem that ends with you referring to Achilles and Hector as 2 psychos, I thought, my God, of course, they're 2 psychos. Another thing that persists in the volume, as the cover shows, are horses.
Yes.
There's 10 horse poems in there. And then the final section, or the penultimate section, is a sort of a prose poem, which is all about horses, of all different ways of thinking about horses. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, ironically, I've never ridden a horse. I've never really been around horses all that much, and I'm not 100% sure how it came about. My daughters and I used to play this game where we would see these horses when we were driving to school. We lived in a kind of rural part of Vancouver Island at the time, and we started saying feral equus every time it was this, and it was just a game with children, right? And
not everybody's game with children.
Yeah.
But okay.
Well,
you're a poet.
Yeah, exactly. There were other feral bovine and other things of the sort, and I think that maybe kind of unlocked this attention to horses, and but there's symbolic, and maybe it's that I don't have a relationship to them personally, that they could hold this place in this book. I mean, in the poem Winter Horses, there are these times where I have encountered horses in my life, and they do seem kind of mysterious and strange. The other thing, that last long piece that you were writing about, I was interested in the sort of genetic history of horses, and the idea that the horse originates in the landmass that we call North America, and then is absent from this for a few thousand years, not very long really, and then they sort of come back and across the Atlantic. And I was interested in what happens, like how do you become, are these indigenous animals? If they originated here, have been absent from here, like how do we think about that kind of, I think it's a little bit too on the nose to say genetics is like an indigenous component, but there is something to that. And so that was another helpful thing for me in the broader sense of the book.
So you've made it clear repeatedly already that place is very important in your writing in general. Would you mind reading Okanagan Nice to us, because it's one of the poems that's about the place of Vancouver Island?
This is actually about my new home. I moved to the Okanagan Valley, which is in the central south part of British Columbia. It's the very northern end of the desert that reaches through Washington and all the way down to Mexico. So Okanagan Nice is a kind of rock. I was doing something wrong with my life. In the highlands, sunlight outlined the lodgepole pine, making a black absence in the blue sky, the exact shape of a pine. Let me sketch for you the red cedar alone in the lower dark, with its sash of moss woven from pure green filaments of age, or the white aspen swimming in its riffle of sky, or the vine maple's old Welsh scrawled in gnarled script across the underbrush. Yes, I was doing something wrong with my life. Listen, the foley has forgotten the bird call and your stomach and the horse's breath, but not the brittle tick of leaves falling like sunlight, like someone approaching fast from behind. Everything we need to know is locked up in this folio of rock I see you reading with your mind. Nothing is too hard when you know how alone you are.
It's a beautiful poem. I'm looking at it from across the table, and it kind of looks like a sonnet, but it's too long. It's too many lines, and the lines are too long. But it has that kind of sonnet quality.
Especially if put next to the other one.
Yeah.
It does. We could call it a sonnet. I'm sure somebody could make an argument for it.
Well, I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about sonnets is love poems.
Sure, yes.
And it is a kind of a love poem, don't you think?
I mean, I think I was trying to figure out how to live in this new place. And I was walking with my daughter, and so she's the one who I see reading the rocks. And the rocks they look kind of like pages, right? There. And yeah, I'm not sure what it is that I was doing wrong with my life in the poem, but there was something about like not paying attention, and that wanting to pay attention. And this is a poem to invite that attention.
So you pay attention to history, both in your poems and also in your fiction, and you're also a fiction writer. And in your collection, What I Want to Tell goes like this. It sort of moves back and forth between the early 20th century and the present. And some of the stories in there are really, really grounded in very specific historical events and the labor movement of the early 20th century. What about that interest, and why is it that the fiction compelled you to really focus on that historical concern?
I wrote that book over 10 years. I think the earliest stories I wrote before I came to Oregon. So and I haven't really written fiction since. So I think I was, in some ways, just learning to write prose.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of it, teaching myself that the way the book works is not super obvious, and I didn't make it obvious, but the historical stories take place almost in exactly the same place, like physically, as the contemporary stories.
Mm.
So where there are sort of acts of violence from the past or various kinds of conflict from the past, there is a new story happening now that my sense was that that energy remains in the place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On some level, and it has an influence on us. I'd moved to Vancouver Island not long after I went back to Canada, and I was living in a town called Cumberland, which is an old mining town. Mm-hmm. In the turn of the century, it had the largest Chinese population after Vancouver and San Francisco. So I was watching all these men go to work in the oil fields and come home and be away, and I was thinking about the work that had been done 100 years before, and I wanted to explore that.
Well, the experience of reading the volume and reading those stories, I think it's very interesting that you say that it's a kind of located in the same place. It's a clarifying and powerful way of thinking about it. It's helpful. Mm-hmm. We just have about a minute left. So I'm just going to ask you the last question,
Sure.
which is, have you read anything recently that's inspired you that you'd like to advocate that we should read?
You should read The Broken Face by Russell Thornton. He's a North Vancouver poet. He is probably my favorite Canadian poet. He was nominated for the Griffin Prize a couple of years ago. He's not unknown, but he's not nearly as well known as he should be. It's one of those books that is it's once familiar and also unlike anything else that you will find. So.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that recommendation. Thank you, Matt, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with the writer Matt Rader, Assistant Professor of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. An alumnus of the UO's Creative Writing program, Rader returned to give a reading on November 7th, 2018. Thanks so much for watching.